squad, Snacks here. Today I have a video that talks about my new live rig setup. As many of you guys know, I had the complete honor of being able to play Red Rocks earlier this year, which was crazy. So today I'm going to be talking about my live setup that includes my Ableton Live rig, my hardware, my live instrument integration, how I got other musicians involved, the learning process, and just the experience of the whole gig in general, because there's a lot to cover. So for all of you nerds, I hope that you enjoy this because this took a lot of time to build and make. This process also might be the closest to a brain aneurysm I've ever been. Welcome back to live music, you guys. So I want to talk about the experience of actually playing Red Rocks a little bit, just because I cannot express to you how incredibly disorienting it was to get that in my inbox after a year and a half of not playing any shows. So up until Red Rocks, the largest venue that I had played was maybe like a 700 something cap room when I was touring with Anomalie back in 2019. And that setup was just the SP, my violin, I had a keyboardist with me, and then vocals. It's very simple. It's all hardware. But with this, I really wanted to step my game up because it's like, why not? It's Red Rocks. And I also realized that if something ever happened to my SP, not saying that the SP isn't reliable, but if something were to malfunction, I have no backup plan. So that's how I also learned what a redundant system is, and I'll talk about that later in the video. So I got the idea to hit up my brother Adam, who is a drummer by profession, and I wanted to share the stage with him as well as pick his brain about playback engineering, which he has experience in. So he was awesome, and he drove up from Los Angeles to come hang out with me in Portland for like a week, and we just brainstormed and workshopped. And I have here in my notes that I spent most of the week crying and pulling my hair out, but we don't have any video footage of that. So Anomalie has this amazing video on YouTube with reverb.com where he goes over his entire live setup on Ableton in arrangement view. And I learned so much from that video, but I still had some questions. So fortunately, I was able to reach out to him, and he's just like so helpful. And so we actually had a Zoom call about it, and he walked me through all of his MIDI stacks and stuff. And that's largely how I based my session. My session is a little bit different than his, but a lot of it is very similar. So if I say something that doesn't entirely make sense here, you're welcome and encouraged to check out that video because it's extremely thorough and very informative. Additionally, I reached out to a front of house audio engineer named Mike Sassano, who has worked with acts like Maggie Rogers, Tori Kelly, Louis the Child, and Sweetie. Basically, we hopped onto a phone call and just talked about like front of house routing and how we were going to get our outputs to the front of house, how we were going to get our click back to our in-ear monitors, and just kind of general stuff that Adam and I were not entirely sure how we were going to pull off, especially because our setup is a little bit unique. Huge shout out to both Mike and Anomalie, because without those two, this would have been even more of a headache. This actually isn't music related, but it's maybe one of the coolest things about this entire experience, which is how I actually got to Colorado and back. So there is a company called Overbuilt Adventure out in Bend, Oregon, and they were kind enough to let me and my friend Marshall borrow a Jeep Rubicon that was totally decked out with like a pop-up tent, fridge in the back, stove, and everything for like 2 weeks, which was awesome. And it was such a fun experience to be able to like camp on the way to Colorado and then camp on the way out. But I just wanted to give them a shout out because they are awesome. They're also huge modular synth nerds, and we love that. So essentially there are 7 outputs. There's my violin in that signal chain. There's the Ableton signal chain that goes through the SP404. Then my brother's SPDX, his overhead mic for his percussion, my vocal mic, Michaela's vocal mic, and then the click track that we are hearing through our in-ear monitors. And I just want to give a quick shout out to ADV Sound because they really hooked it up with the in-ear monitors, and that's what I ended up using for the performance. In terms of the violin signal chain, I have a video that talks about this a lot more in depth if you want to see what each pedal individually does. But just to give you an overview, it starts with my violin that goes into my organelle for that initial synth tone. Then it goes into the Meris Enzo, where I have a preset bar that captures 4 different presets from the Meris Enzo, so I can do pitch shifting things as well as synthesized things. Then it goes into my Iron Horse distortion, and then it goes into the Ages overdrive, which then goes into the Empress Para EQ that I use for EQ sculpting, followed by the Empress Echo system, where I can also have presets of long delay echoes and different kinds of analog versus digital versus what have you kind of echoes. And then the secret sauce, which I know I'm very biased about, but I do put the Bad Snacks Caverns at the end of my signal chain, and I had the shimmer on for most of the songs because it just adds that extra chef's kiss. Followed then by a volume pedal, and then after that, it's just direct out, straight to front of house. Then we have Ableton coming from 2 different computers, then going into the Play Audio 12, which I'll talk about in a second because it's a built-in redundant system. That's being controlled by 2 MIDI controllers, which is the Novation Launch Key 49. I have the MK3 series, and then I also have a Launchpad X that's doing kind of master controls of the session. The Ableton sessions are playing mostly backing tracks for instruments that neither my brother nor I are playing. And then after that, it goes through the output of the Play Audio 12, and that goes into the SP404, where I then enable the external sound setting on the SP404 so I can do DJ effects live as the sound is going through the 404. And at different times in the set, I can also trigger different samples from the 404 directly. And then that goes to the front of house as well. Adam's setup was actually really straightforward. He just had loaded up one-shots from the sessions on his SPDS. That was going directly to the front of house as well. And then he had the overheads that were capturing his percussion. That's also very straightforward. And then both Dear Evergreen and I had vocal mics that also go to front of house. So then when it comes to the click is actually coming out of channel 3 of the Play Audio 12 interface, and that's because we routed it that way in Ableton. And then we send the click alongside with all of our other instruments to the side stage monitor mix, and then that mix is sent back to our in-ears with a combination of the click and the rest of the instruments. Meanwhile, the front of house is sending a slightly different mix, one that does not have the click, to the venue at large. So that's kind of how that works. So I want to talk about the iConnectivity Play Audio 12 just for a minute here, because this ended up saving my butt. And full disclosure, nothing about this video is sponsored today. This is just genuinely me talking about how this saved my butt. So in live playback, you have this thing called a redundant system, which is essentially that if you have a live performance that includes computers, you have one computer that's doing the playback, the tracks and whatnot, and if anything ever happened to that computer, like it started skipping or whatever, that there's a way to swiftly send it over to a synced computer, and that way you have kind of like a safety net. I heard about this Play Audio 12 by iConnectivity, which is essentially a very small scale redundant system. So the way that this works is that you send your MIDI controllers in through the host, and then this sends MIDI out to the 2 computers that it's connected to. And you have to have identical sessions, otherwise it's gonna get really weird. So you have it connected to 2 computers, your computer A and your computer B, that are both synced at the same time because of the MIDI signals that you're sending it. And then you have the output through the back of this Play Audio. So the way that this knows when one computer is failing and to switch over to the other computer is that you have to get a VST called life sign when you get this, and what you do is you put it on a channel that you then route to channel 13. And what that does is that it makes it so if anything happens to that sine wave at all, there's any disruption, it'll immediately and automatically switch to the other computer, and you would never know. That's what's what's really cool about this. So even if there's like an issue with the USB controls or something, or if one computer freezes up, if it detects any kind of disruption in the signal, it'll automatically and flawlessly go to the other computer. So this ended up really just giving me a huge peace of mind for this performance. Welcome to my Ableton session. So let's start with the audio files, which is like kind of what I would call the easier to figure out part, although it was still very meticulous. So basically I had to remaster my stems for this show because I had songs that were like unreleased and then songs that just weren't mastered for live. And typically speaking, my songs are usually mastered as bounced tracks, not stem by stem. So fortunately, I was able to reach out to my friend Scott Welch, who has mastered a bunch of my projects, and he helped me with actually mastering the individual stems so that I could take out certain parts. So for instance, this opening track, basically the whole backing track except for a good chunk of the drums is left in there because I'm playing violin and talking on top of it, and then Adam is playing drums. And that's essentially the approach that I took for all of these tracks, is just basically figuring out which instruments were being played, which ones weren't being played, and having the backing tracks kind of consolidated behind there. And that way, that keeps the CPU way, way, way down because there aren't any effects being automated, there aren't any plugins, it's just the mastered stems. So that's the audio part of the session, and that part's definitely the more straightforward part, although I will say that had Scott not been able to help me with remastering the stems, that would have taken a lot more time, that's for sure. So thank you, Scott, you're the best. So let's move on to the hard part, which is the MIDI. I have here my Launch Key 49 by Novation. This is the MK3. I also have a Novation Launchpad X. Now, these are doing two separate things. This is basically my synthesizer because all of my synths for this performance were soft synths. And then this, you can actually see where Adam left the markings. So this is essentially our transport. So we have our play, stop, and then moving backwards and forwards with the locators, which I'll go over in a second. Again, I just want to point out that this was largely based off of Anomalie's live session, and I made a couple adjustments, but if what I do doesn't make sense, definitely check out the other video that he did with Reverb because it's super insightful. Before we even get into this, with the launch key, you can separate the MIDI channels for each output. So my keys are under channel 4, and my drum pad here is under channel 3. So you'll see that reflected in the keys MIDI track and the drums MIDI track, where you can see I have it selected channel 4 and then channel 3. This isn't going to trigger anything, but you can see the signal. So these have nothing in them. They're literally just the record-enabled signals for the MIDI. The next step is then the stacks. So this is where it starts getting a little bit more complicated, but a little bit more organized. So I have my keys stack, where I can double-click it, and you basically see my instrument rack here, where I have a bunch of instruments that are then distributed throughout the instrument chain selector. That was one thing, is you can set a range of values and then right-click it and then distribute ranges equally, and that's how you get all of these to be fairly equal in size, and it just makes it easier for automation down the line. Now with the drum stack, I just used the drum stack to trigger my samples. So I only had 3 banks of samples. It's essentially the same format. And I also want you to notice that these are both routed to the initial MIDI track. So this is going to go to keys MIDI, and this is going to go to drums MIDI. So I grouped my synths, and these are each of my synths throughout the set. Now what you'll notice is that these are all set to monitor in, and what I did is I actually put the input from keys stack, and then I put the post effects to the corresponding instrument rack. So I put it as post effects Jupiter, so whenever the Jupiter from my keys stack instrument rack is triggered, it's going to trigger this instrument. Kind of see how that works? And it's the exact same process with the samples here. So these are my 3 sample banks, and I have them routed from drum stack and then post effects correlating. These are all monitor in again. So the third step of this organizational process is automating the instrument chain selector of the instrument rack so that the synth sounds would automatically change depending on where I am in the song. So what that looks like if I open up my automation is this. And this took a little bit of time to map. So basically, if I collapse my automation, depending on where I am in the set, like here, that's a fun one, here, sound changes automatically. And again, because they're on separate MIDI channels, same thing goes for the drum stack. So one way to keep the CPU down, which was a question that a lot of people had on Instagram, is that I automated it so that every instrument would turn off automatically when it wasn't being used. I can go into all of these devices and you can see where it says device on, off, so that way there aren't a bunch of plugins on at the same time, because a lot of these instrument racks have a lot of plugins on them. Speaking of automation, here is the song tempo map because I had to obviously put the click in for every single song. So there's just like a lot of automation going on in this session. I spent a lot of time on this, you guys. So when it comes to MIDI mapping, there's just a couple things to note because I have 2 MIDI controllers here and ultimately 3 different MIDI signals. I have my keys MIDI controller, which obviously affects my MIDI synths. Then I have my drum pad, that's for the samples. But then I also am using the Launchpad X as a means to control the session and the transport. And so the first thing you want to do is you want to go into your preferences and you just want to make sure that you have this enabled on track and remote so that you can use the CC parameters. And then for the MIDI controller that you're using for the actual transport, not the instruments, you want to take it off of track mode and onto remote mode. And then when it comes to MIDI mapping certain things, Ableton makes it really easy. So all you have to do is go to MIDI map mode, so you can do Command M. And then literally you just click on certain buttons, like I wanted to use play, stop, and then forward and back in the locators. And I literally just hit the corresponding buttons that I want to use. And it's the same thing with certain instruments. I just hit Command M and then I click on the parameters that I want and then I just use the faders and whatever. And then that's how it's mapped. It's super easy. And then yeah, there's not really much else to this session. You'll note that the click track is sent to output 3 and then we have the stereo going out 1 and 2 and then output 1 and 2 went into my SP404. And that's basically all she wrote. So playing Red Rocks is obviously a huge career highlight, and it was such a powerful experience, and I ended up turning it into a whole week-long affair. Like I got an Airbnb and a bunch of my friends came in from out of the state, and it was such a good time. And huge shout out to the Floozies and to Maddie O'Neill for having me with them. They killed it afterwards, and it was so fun being able to see the show from backstage afterwards. I just want to give a shout out to this list of people. Without their help or their guidance or anything, this just would have been such a impossible project. So now it's time for frequently asked questions from Instagram. I wanted to open up the floor to some nerdy questions. Okay. Octave Willis asks, what was the ratio of improvisation/planned set? So a lot of the set was planned. Actually, fun fact, this is the first show I've ever performed on keys. So I wanted to make sure that part was at least planned. But basically, any violin solo was partially improvised. I try really hard to leave those sections open specifically for improvisation. So Neil Guys asks, what would you like to improve about the setup? So there are better ways to set it up than how I did. For instance, I could have sent all of my different instruments from Ableton to different outputs on the interface and then sent those individual instruments straight to the front of house so then they could mix it. that would probably warrant a little bit more independence, and I probably could have processed instruments in Ableton itself, but that's just not how I did things. So that's something that I'm gonna experiment with in the future, but for now, this setup it worked fine. Yeah, where did I get my blue glasses? Got them at Buffalo Exchange, baby, for like $3. I'm so bad with outros. Don't forget to smash.
Ring, ding that bell.
Ding, ring-a-ling, ding that bell. No. Thanks for watching, you guys. Obviously, this was a huge chapter in my musical life, so I am very, very happy to finally be kind of sharing with you guys what the process was like. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section, and I will try to get back to them as best as I can. Anyway, take care. Thanks for watching. Bye. Goodbye from Bean. He's kind of smiling.